In this podcast episode, host Andrea sits down with Anil Seth, a professor of cognitive and computational neuroscience at the University of Sussex and a leading researcher in consciousness studies. They engage in a wide-ranging conversation that explores the nature of perception, the self, consciousness, reality, and artificial intelligence. Through their dialogue, they examine how our experiences of the world and self are constructed by the brain, the implications of altered states of consciousness, and the philosophical and scientific challenges involved in understanding what it means to be conscious. Anil Seth opens by challenging the common assumption that perception is a passive reception of an objective world. Instead, he explains that the brain actively generates the world we experience through a process of prediction and inference. He uses color perception as an example, highlighting that colors do not exist as inherent properties in the physical world, but are constructed by the brain's interpretation of electromagnetic radiation. Rather than passively receiving sensory data, the brain constantly predicts incoming sensory signals and updates its internal model based on discrepancies between expectations and actual input. This back and forth between top-down predictions and bottom-up sensory feedback results in our experience of reality being akin to a controlled hallucination, an internally generated best guess tightly regulated by sensory evidence. The conversation moves to the idea that perception depends heavily on prior knowledge and expectations, some innate and some learned, embedded within the brain. These priors shape how sensory information is interpreted and can lead to significant variability in experience between individuals. For example, perceptual illusions demonstrate that even with the same sensory input, people can experience the world quite differently. The famous ambiguous image of the dress, perceived variably as blue and black or white and gold by different viewers, illustrates that what we see is profoundly influenced by subjective factors. Seth emphasizes the lesson of perceptual humility, that our conscious experience is a unique construction and does not necessarily reflect an unmediated reality. Seth discusses large-scale studies, such as the perception census, which investigate how perception varies across tens of thousands of participants using visual illusions and other tasks. These studies reveal systematic differences in how people perceive color, size, faces, and time, showing distributions with averages and individual tails. This variability mirrors the biological diversity found in physical traits across humans, and offers insightful windows into how evolution shapes perception as a variable, adaptive system. He points out how understanding these differences might have practical applications, such as adapting environments for people with cognitive impairments like dementia, informed by how their perception of the world changes over time. Andrea asks about the self and the influence of memory on our perception of identity. Seth explains that while immediate memories inform daily perception, long-term memories and evolutionary history provide a framework that shapes our ongoing experience of selfhood. Even if short-term memories were erased, the brain's evolved models would still generate a recognizable face in the mirror due to inherited neural structures that encode faces. The self is thus not a fixed essence, but a dynamic process constantly shaped by the brain's predictive mechanisms. Seth reflects on thought experiments about stripped-down consciousness, including the classic floating man question, noting that consciousness without sensory input or memory may reduce to a formless sense of aliveness rather than an identifiable I. Seth stresses the complexity of using first-person experiences as evidence for metaphysical claims about the nature of consciousness and reality. He illustrates this with examples such as out-of-body experiences and psychedelic states, which feel subjectively real but are better explained as brain-generated phenomena rather than literal departures from the physical body or entry into a more fundamental reality. While altered states may challenge everyday assumptions and reveal new dimensions of experience, they do not constitute definitive proof that consciousness extends beyond the brain or that the universe is intrinsically conscious. He calls for epistemic humility when interpreting these compelling but subjective experiences. Throughout the conversation, Seth ties consciousness closely to life itself, underscoring that our conscious experience arises within living systems that engage actively with their environments. However, he maintains that being alive is likely necessary but not sufficient for consciousness. For example, trees, despite their complex biochemical signaling and sensitivity, lack nervous systems and the rapid behavioral flexibility seen in animals and are therefore unlikely to be conscious. Consciousness appears to be an evolved biological capacity linked to brains that enable rapid adaptive responses in complex and changing environments, distinct from mere sensitivity or life. Using Thomas Nagel's classic phrasing, Seth defines consciousness as what it is like to be something, the existence of any subjective experience. While this minimal definition captures consciousness broadly, questions remain about which organisms or systems possess it. Seth is confident in the consciousness of mammals but is more uncertain about fish and insects, reflecting the ongoing scientific endeavor to map consciousness in the natural world. He acknowledges linguistic confusion around related terms such as sentience and awareness, advocating for clarity and precision. When prompted to steelman the panpsychist position, the idea that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the universe, Seth offers a generous but ultimately skeptical account. Panpsychism posits that matter itself possesses intrinsic consciousness, bridging the explanatory gap left by materialist science. While compatible with neuroscientific findings, it introduces new challenges such as the combination problem of how simple conscious entities combine into complex ones. Seth expresses more affinity for some forms of idealism, where consciousness is the fundamental substance and matter emerges within it, though he remains pragmatic and open-minded about these metaphysical views. He emphasizes that metaphysical claims cannot be decisively settled by introspective experience alone. Free will emerges as a domain of maximal resistance in the exploration of selfhood. Seth distinguishes between the libertarian notion of free will, a non-determined, causally effective, uncaused cause, independent of physical laws, which he rejects, and the compatibilist view he endorses. In his view, although our sense of agency is a useful construct aligning with beliefs and desires, it is ultimately determined by complex neurobiological processes. The experience of free will is important for social functioning and moral responsibility, even if it does not reflect an ability to have acted otherwise in an absolute sense. Turning to one of the most pressing contemporary issues, Seth shares his perspective on AI and consciousness, expressing skepticism that current or near-future AI systems, such as large language models, are conscious. He identifies two key pitfalls fueling mistaken attribution of consciousness to AIs: anthropocentric biases and the conflation of intelligent behavior with phenomenological experience. Language-capable systems appear conscious because they mimic human communicative behaviors, but underlying mechanisms differ radically. Unlike biological brains with integrated continuous dynamics, silicon-based AI operates through discrete, implementationally separate computation, making consciousness as understood neurobiologically unlikely. Seth warns of societal risks if AIs are mistakenly granted moral status or rights without conscious experience, including ethical dilemmas governing their treatment and regulatory challenges that could hamper technological control and oversight. Reflecting on mortality, Seth explores the conceptual difficulty of imagining non-existence, underscoring the asymmetry between pre-birth non-existence and post-death non-existence. He discusses the self as a mutable process rather than a persistent, unchanging essence, emphasizing that what dies is a momentary configuration of the self rather than a singular I. Drawing on contemplative traditions, Seth suggests the possibility that bare consciousness, an undifferentiated, formless sense of aliveness, might be the closest aspect of experience to an enduring core. Nonetheless, he acknowledges that concrete self-identity is rooted in temporal continuity and memory, and how this continuity unravels toward death remains a profound mystery. Throughout the episode, Seth reflects on how learning about consciousness and perception can foster greater compassion, humility, and awe. Appreciating the constructed nature of perception and self may soften rigid attachments to individual viewpoints and identities, potentially alleviating suffering born from mistaken certainties. He envisions future research applying insights about perception variability to mental health interventions, such as experimental visual hallucination therapies akin to psychedelic treatments, to open new avenues for alleviating depression and enriching human experience. Anil Seth discusses his ongoing research priorities, which include exploring the relationship between consciousness and life, as well as investigating the implications and nature of consciousness in AI. He is writing a new book focused on how artificial intelligence can illuminate aspects of human consciousness and perception by highlighting what distinguishes us from machines. He is also interested in large-scale studies using sensory manipulations, like stroboscopic light, to induce controlled hallucinations, as potential tools for both basic neuroscience and therapeutic innovation. Seth situates the study of consciousness within the broader scientific framework, drawing parallels with other challenging scientific phenomena, such as quantum mechanics and the origin of life. He highlights that scientific theories need not offer intuitive understanding, but must explain, predict, and allow control over phenomena. The meta-problem of consciousness, why humans perceive consciousness as so mysterious, may partly be explained by cognitive limitations and expectations rather than the intractability of the phenomenon itself. This perspective favors a pragmatic materialist approach that treats consciousness as a natural, albeit deeply complex aspect of biological systems. Finally, Seth advocates for intellectual humility in grappling with consciousness, recognizing the limits of current knowledge and the seductive pull of metaphysical certainty. He underscores that, unlike many scientific challenges, consciousness is unique because it involves explaining a phenomenon we directly instantiate and experience. This dual role complicates the task, but also makes the inquiry profoundly meaningful, inspiring a sense of wonder and appreciation for the everyday miracle of being conscious.